Ladies and gentlemen, the RetroGaming.com video, as many of you know, Build 2015, presented by Microsoft, has been raging on over the weekend, and there have been a lot of exciting announcements, especially with DirectX 12. And in fact, McCullen has gone into quite a few exciting new details. So in this video, we're going to be doing some analysis of that. This is also an article if you want to check it out. It's linked in the video description, where I've actually got all of the slides from the presentation which are pertinent and put them all into the relevant parts, plus as well links some other videos which you'll probably find interesting, for example the demos, the tech demos, and on top of that relevant links for further research should you desire. But of course we will be discussing it in a more informal stage, if you will, in this video. So let's begin, shall we? So we're going to be starting things out a little bit differently from the discussion itself. In fact, I want to take things in a slightly different order, because I think it probably is going to serve us better for this format. So, to begin with, let's discuss the basic stuff. Microsoft have said at this point that the SDK and API that you and I have access to, or developers have access to, is virtually the one that's shipping, and that's a good thing. It means that most of the bugs by now are pretty much ironed out. This also means that AMD, Intel, Nvidia, in other words the three major vendors, have drivers which are almost finished. There's still a few things they need to improve, but it's virtually in the final form. And this also means that most gamers, 50% of gamers, of the high-end gamers now, actually have DirectX 12 compatible hardware, and this number is going to be rising very quickly over the next coming months, up to about 67% by holiday 2015. This rate of adoption is actually the fastest since DirectX 9. In fact, it might even be faster than D3D9. Microsoft is still exactly calculating it, but they already have a lot of studios and a lot of different game engine providers. For example, obviously you've got Unity, you've got Unreal, and so on, and custom engines, all of which fully support DX12. One of the reasons behind this is Microsoft have obviously really pushed towards integration with Xbox One and a wider architecture, the larger Microsoft suite, and we'll be getting into that in just a moment. Now, Visual Studio has recently been updated, and they've included powerful new debugging tools. So obviously, debugging in its most basic can be, why is this crashing? So for example, you know, the old, is it line 53 that's missing a semicolon, all the way down to, am I running out of memory on this specific part, or what have you. Now, Microsoft have gone multiple stages further, obviously, with different iterations of Visual Studio, but the latest one also allows them to really give you a drill down into GPU and CPU performance. So in short, you can figure out, is this bit of code causing a problem? Is it, say, I've got too much lighting in this particular section of the game? Am I using too many assets? Am I not streaming data correctly from the CPU? Or is there, you know, maybe a CPU threading issue? And it will also obviously allow you to iterate that over multiple forms of hardware, and basically get a really good understanding of what you can do to improve performance on your game, which is ultimately the crux of the matter. We've discussed heavily, actually, over the last few days, the Universal Windows Platform, and obviously this is Microsoft combining all of their APIs and to start leveraging the Microsoft ecosystem, the Windows ecosystem, to their advantage. In other words, the Xbox One, the PC, and of course mobile as well. Now, the developers behind King of Wushu, Snail Games, have actually put together the first DirectX 12 game out of China, and currently they've actually ported the Xbox One code over to the PC in less than 2 weeks, and that, by the way, is with just 2 engineers. Now, the code is not just working on the PC, but there are some major advantages. Now, obviously, you've got things such as parallelized command list. You've got execution across multiple CPUs, which is all stuff we've discussed now as improved multi-threading. But the bottom line is, while performance at the moment is only around 10% higher in terms of the frame rate, the real shiny here isn't, you know, a few extra percent of performance, but it's the fact you're actually getting a larger number of enemies, 1.5 times the number of enemies than DirectX 11, and performance is still higher. Now, the crazy thing is, this is within just 6 weeks, and they've still got a lot of stuff they need to do. In other words, they've not even slightly pushed towards, the end performance goals. They've still got a lot of DirectX code tweaks they can still do to really make sure that their engine's getting the maximum performance out of it. And it's just incredible. I mean, that number of extra enemies is amazing. Just looking at the video, it's definite that this is a major factor in gameplay. It makes the game look more fun. And I imagine playing more fun. I've not actually played it, but this also brings us into other bits and bobs like pipeline state objects, where the graphics pipeline is being treated very differently from DirectX 11, where things were very, well, to be totally honest with you, they're very fine-grained. Things had to be very methodical, bit by bit by bit. So for example, you have multiple states, for example the assembler state, the pixel state, and DirectX 12 handles this very differently. It's a lot more fluid. If you want more information on that, it is in the article, but we've already got so much more to go, so I want to keep this smoothly, and I've already discussed pipeline stuff before. If you did need more information, it's in the article, which is linked. So there also were some interviews. Square Enix's Ivan Gavrenkov, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, he also said that the biggest benefit of DirectX 12, and we've heard this multiple times, is the greater control over the GPU. And it's not just that, you've got improved multi-threading or any of that stuff, but it's also how GPU resources are allocated. For example, VRAM, for example, shaders, for example, what or how do you want assets to stream into the GPU? All of this stuff is incredibly important, and you can actually still leave stuff to be driver controlled, or you can go ahead and actually control those resources yourself. So you could still treat everything very similar to DirectX 11. For example, you can still use 128 textures or 16 buffers, blah blah blah, but you can also, in those circumstances, almost certainly be forced to cache everything, and you're going to have to manage the data really carefully, or you're going to start running out of, for example, VRAM. So what you can do is you can start binding resources very carefully and specifically based on what you need. So for example, obviously you can have multiple buffers going on. So what you could do, if you only need, for example, a certain number of assets in a certain specific section or a certain set of shaders, then you can simply bind fewer resources to those. Just for FYI, resource is basically a collection of data. So it could, let's just for example say textures, and binding simply means you're specifying to the GPU a source of data. Now this ties in really well with DirectX 12's memory management, because developers are able to therefore allocate heaps of memory for various resources in the GPU, and we're definitely going to be getting into the resources and binding of memory much more in just a second. But essentially, let's assume that you start getting out of memory on a GPU, and it's getting to the point where it's like, let's just say you've got 2 gigs of VRAM, just for the sake of argument, and almost all of that VRAM's up. Well, you need to stream in extra data because let's say that you're moving from a forest to more of a city area. Well, what's going to happen? Rather obviously, the GPU needs to free up memory because it can't just load assets into nothing. So essentially what it's going to start doing is streaming out data, swapping data from the GPU, possibly back into main system memory. So in a PC's scenario, typical PC, how this would work in a nutshell is the graphics card's memory would then channel that data through the PCI connection back into the slower, but obviously generally a lot more abundant DDR3 memory, because let's face it, most people might have, for example, a 2, 3, 4 gigabyte graphics card but have like 8 or 16 or even more gigabytes of DDR3 memory, which obviously makes all the difference in the world, considering that one of the biggest culprits of gobbling up memory is, generally speaking, well, textures. And they may decide to say compress them as they're going back into memory or what have you. So, this means that draw calls, because of the lower draw call cost, games are going to become richer. This is going to mean that you're going to have a greater number of lights, which means you're going to have extra shadows on the scene, you're going to have increased draw distance. This is simply because obviously the engine can actually handle more objects on screen, and more specifically, more unique, non-cloned objects. I'm pretty sure that if you've played a PC game or a console game and you've ever walked into a forest or you've ever been through any kind of area on pretty much any game, if you look really carefully, you can see an awful lot of clone brush. And yes, obviously it does take less time for the developers to, do that artistically, but another reason behind it is it's actually cheaper for them to draw a tree which looks very similar to the next tree, just because of how draw calls work. So because of all of this, along with other stuff such as executing direct, which we've discussed in detail in previous DirectX 12 analysis, which obviously is simply the GPU being able to issue its own commands, then we can start seeing rather large performance advantages, and obviously from that you can basically do a lot more stuff. Performance goes up in step, really. So he didn't pull any punches when he said that, the API is just really out of date when it comes to DirectX 11 or pretty much anything else. We know that Vulkan obviously is going to be a major competitor to DirectX 12, but generally, previously the PC, you've had these GPUs like, the R9 290X, you've had the Titan or the Titan X, all of these GPUs which have incremented their power massively over the previous generation, but you'll get problems where you'll have like 80% GPU usage or 75% GPU usage, or you'll have where the CPU isn't able to keep up, or what have you, and the problem is the API is the root cause. It's like, it doesn't matter what optimizations the developers do, at the end of the day, the interface to the GPU is the API. The API obviously sits in kind of like the sandwich. So the application will talk to DirectX, DirectX will talk to the graphics card driver, and the graphics card driver will then talk to the GPU and say, I need you to do Y. But obviously if you've got this problem where the API is just inefficient and just not shiny, it can't do that. It can't do that effectively. Vulkan is improving things, which obviously, as I said, is being developed by the Kronos group, which have a lot of different partners and probably is going to be a major competitor eventually to DirectX as well. So we've blasted through a lot of that because the biggest part I wanted to actually talk about is the multi-adapter stuff, because most of this other stuff is stuff we've already discussed or things that are kind of known, so not amazingly new. The multi-adapter stuff, on the other hand, is really different, and it's actually interesting because we've heard rumours about it a while back. So DirectX 12 changes things massively over DirectX 11, and effectively you could say that Crossfire and SLI's explicit technologies, in other words the vendor specific technologies, no longer really technically providing your supporting it by your own application. They technically no longer need to exist. So what does that actually mean? Well, there are a couple of different methods that you can actually use, or application developers can use, to run multiple GPUs in a system. So the first one is linked GPUs. So what is a linked GPU? It basically very much is what you'd expect for given the name. It simply means that the GPUs, two GPUs for example, are going to be treated and to the application look like a single GPU, but developers can still actually create their own individual queues, for example, for rendering to individual processors, and possibly the biggest thing is each GPU can have its own local resources and assets. Furthermore, it's actually possible for each card to read and access data from another card. So assuming you've got two GPUs, so let's call it GPU A and GPU B, GPU could still access the data that's resident in the memory of GPU B, and it would do this either a couple of ways. It could do it either via the PCIe bus, or it could do it via a dedicated bridge, which is, for example, an SLI bridge or whatever other connection that happens to pop up in the future, which is really, really nice. Now, obviously, you might risk saturating the PCIe bus on that. It depends, obviously, on the specifications of the card and what you're trying to do, but it's nice to be able to do it. Unlinked is possibly the more exciting of the two, but it's also a little more complicated. So how this works is that each GPU can have its own rendering queue. This allows you to have completely different GPU configurations perform different tasks. So one example of this would be a discrete GPU, let's say for the sake of argument, an Intel GPU or integrated GPU with an NVIDIA GPU. So for example, a Titan. Now obviously there's a massive mismatch of performance, but what you can do is you can get the IGP to do things which aren't particularly demanding. So one of those would be post-processing. So it could do multiple different forms of post-processing, whether it's anti-aliasing, whether it's warping, for example, for virtual reality displays, whether it's, say, motion blur, whatever the post-process effect is. Now, the benefit is it's still offloading workload from the GPU, or the main GPU, but you're also leveraging the IGP, which at the moment, it doesn't really do anything. If you're running, let's say, Windows 8 with, let's say, I don't know, an R9 290X, for example, and at the same time, you're running that with an Intel whatever, that Intel CPU that Intel IGP is doing zero. It's doing nothing. Although technically it's hardware in the system that could be used for something, it can't be at the moment just because of the way DirectX works. Now it's different. It basically will allow you to have additional performance. How much obviously depends on the type of hardware you've got in the system, but you could get like 5%, 10%, 20%, what have you. Now, there is a key for this, which is pretty obvious. There is a mismatch in performance. So what they have to do, or what the developers will have to do, I'm not 100% certain how this will work in the long term, but what you have to do is basically figure out how much of the scene you can render, and then with the dedicated GPU before you can offload it to the IGP. So in short, how much workload can the IGP handle before it gets to the point where it's going to be swamped and it won't actually improve the performance, it'll actually slow it down, which is pretty obvious. Now, what they did is they actually ran a test with Unreal Engine 4. The team created a bit of code which basically leveraged both discrete and integrated GPUs, and the end result was quite clear. The discrete GPU was slower, the single adapter was slower than leveraging the integrated, despite the fact that the integrated GPU, once again, wasn't particularly powerful. And this is just very important. It's an indication of where we can go with this. And what wasn't really answered, unfortunately, at least directly, although it was implied, was, hey, can you run a Radeon with an NVIDIA card? They didn't say it. I don't know why. I don't know if it's because, they didn't want them to say it. In other words, either AMD or NVIDIA didn't want them to say that. I know NVIDIA, and you can Google this yourselves, NVIDIA have not been really particularly friendly when it comes to multi-GPU setups. In fact, folks who used to run an older Radeon card, an older GeForce card for physics, but a Radeon card for graphics, were actually left out in the cold when a drive update hit, and it basically stopped that from happening. And I don't think, to be fair, AMD are particularly massive fans of it either. Every time it was mentioned, it would be something along the lines of an Intel CPU with an AMD GPU, or an Intel CPU with an NVIDIA GPU. It was never, can you run both an Intel GPU with an AMD GPU? And I don't know why they didn't tackle that. I really would have loved them to answer it, but whatever. So anyway, let's move on to Witch Chapter 0, also known as Cry. So this is using a modified version of the Luminous engine, which is the very same engine powering Final Fantasy 15. So what is this demo running? Well, the Witch demo is powered by 4, I'll repeat that word one more time, 4 NVIDIA Titan X's. And it's running in real time. This means that you're actually pushing a staggering, ludicrous, astounding 63 million polygons per scene. And even the textures are running at 8K by 8K. That's a lot of VRAM per texture, by the way. And it's running at 4K, so the resolution is 4K. This video is staggering. It's not just a rendered, pre-rendered image. It's rendered on the fly, and it's actually to the point where you can actually see individual pores of skin. You can see feathers move, you can see hair. The hair, for example, is made of different geometry combined with isotropic shading. You've got physics which are ruffling the feathers on her dress. You've got physics which are moving the clothing, and her skin. I mean, oh my god, the skin. Now, to be fair, the skin obviously is probably one of the defining characteristics of the image. The skin is not 100% new technology, because we've seen similar in, let's say, Ready at Dawn's Order 1886. The difference is you've got a massive increase in GPU performance over the PS4, and this means that you've got multiple materials all coming together to form the texture of the skin. So when she cries and you see the tears coming down her cheek and moving little dirt and debris, it's incredible. This is actually put together by multiple shaders, by multiple layers of textures, and I've got to say, with the advanced lighting and rendering techniques that NVIDIA have put together and actually used on this, and this isn't a technology breakdown necessarily of this time, I'm trying to keep this relatively simple, but just for example, when you see light reflecting off of the skin or the scene as a whole, and remember, it's all 110% alterable, so you can make this a nighttime scene, you can make this a daytime scene, you can make this a dusk scene, and the lighting will change as the developer wishes it, or as the player wishes it, and it's just incredible. It's an indication of what is to come, my friends. The amount of GPU power, I admit, to run this is staggering, but then again, it is running also at 4K. But if this was to run at a more modest resolution, for example 1080p, and you had a pretty good GPU setup, I'm just throwing an example out there, but let's say a couple of Titans or a couple of like high-end AMD cards, we are not so far out. I don't know what the frame rate was, however. So it's just an indication of what's to come. And frankly, the fact that this was rendered with a level of beauty that, to be totally honest with you, rivals the stuff that you'd see in like the Spirits Within, it's mind-boggling. Anyway, we're going to be kind of closing this out now. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I know that it's not been the most technical of videos. I've not gone super duper in depth because we've discussed so much of DirectX 12. We've discussed how Execute Indirect works in painstaking detail. We've discussed things such as how multi-threading works. We've dived really deeply into this stuff, and if you're not too familiar with it, go ahead and check out the article where I've got all the links and you can peruse at your leisure. But for those of us who do know this stuff, I wanted it to be kind of like a hype piece to show us what is the future. And the future, my friends, is very exciting. It's very difficult for me to be neutral. It's very difficult for me when I'm discussing Vulkan, Mantle, when I'm discussing any of these new APIs. It's very difficult for me to be kind of neutral and report it without a little bit of bias, without a little bit of excitement in the air, because from a perspective of a PC gamer, we've been held back. We've had this really old API that's not really current. It doesn't really take advantage of the new architectures of the systems that are available. you know, just even multiple threading, it just can't do it. DirectX 11 multi-threading is awful. In the overhead testing that we did, which is linked in the article, and also if I try to remember, it will be linked in the video description. It's just bad. Like DX11 multi-threading, when it comes to draw calls, at best you get even performance within 1 or 2%, and at worst you're actually losing performance. With DirectX 12, it's massive improvements. Even when we nerfed the CPU in our system, no hyper-threading, 1 CPU core available, DirectX 12 was still 4 times faster than DX11 with all of its CPU cores available. So in short, DirectX 12, in terms of draw calls, stamps on DirectX 11. In terms of the ability for developers and what they're able to push and able to achieve, it stamps on DX 11. And I don't necessarily know if I want DirectX 12 to be the standard. I don't particularly mind whether it's DirectX 12, and I don't mind whether it's Vulkan. What I do want is something new, and I think that this, my friends, this is going to be very exciting. But for now, deeply hope you found this video interesting, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.